Hi everyone, I'm excited to share a project with you created with a new product by Altenew called Watercolor Roses. This stencil set has 4 layers of details, and there is also a coordinating die that can be purchased separately. I love stenciling fast and easy cards, and I also like to look for different ways I can extend the use of my products. Each card today will use a different medium for the stenciling process. I love how it changes the look completely. For the first card, I'll be working with Altenew's dye inks, doing a little bit of rearranging on my ink cube holder so that I can work from lightest to darkest. For the roses, there are 4 layers of details, so I'm going to be working with 4 different colors. The set creates 2 different size roses which are nestled up against one another. To create the 2 different sizes of roses, there are 2 stencils. For each rose, there are 2 details on each stencil. I'm starting off by creating the largest of the 2 roses on Bristol Smooth cardstock. The most open design of the stencil will be the base, and I apply buttercream dye ink, my lightest color. The second layer detail is lined up right at the bottom of the rose, and now I'm going to apply a pretty soft rose color called Cotton Candy. Switch over to the second stencil for the last 2 details. The stencil set comes with illustrated step-by-step instructions for lining up each of the details, which I refer to particularly for the first use. For the third layer, I'm applying Mango Smoothie. When the yellow combines with the pink, I end up with a beautiful tangerine color. The darkest tone is Caramel Toffee, which I apply to the 4th detail to complete the first rose. It is important that the smaller rose is positioned correctly so that it will correspond with the die. The top petal of the largest rose will line up perfectly with the bottom of the smaller rose. And then I go through the same colors again. For the base layer, I apply buttercream. The second layering detail is lined up at the bottom of the base layer, and the pretty rose color Cotton Candy is applied. Switching over to the second stencil, I line up the third layer by referring to the illustrated guide and apply Mango Smoothie. For the 4th and final layer, Caramel Toffee is applied to the center of the flower. For the leaves, there are 2 layers on one stencil. The open base layer is easily lined up around the 2 roses. I apply the lightest of my 2 greens, Frayed Leaf. For the second layer, there's a little square-like opening which corresponds to an area between the small and larger rose. Once that is lined up, you're good to go. For this layer, I'm applying a dark green called Forest Glades. Layering stencils are just so much fun to work with. Look at the beautiful result. The next 2 pair of roses, I'm going to be working on Canson XL watercolor paper. Both panels will be prepped with a Distress Resist product. I create the spatter using a fan brush. This will create some pretty texture for these next 2 set of roses. After the panels are dry, I'm ready to begin. This next pair of roses is going to be stenciled using pigment powders. I start off with a nice thin layer of water, just enough so that there's a sheen. And then I'm tapping on some Nouveau Shimmer Powder Solar Flare. The stencil is held in place simply with a little bit of low-tack tape, and then I hold it down with 2 fingers. Help the color move, I tap it with my watercolor brush. I do not use brush stroke movements. If there are any bits of the powder that do not dissolve, I add in just a touch more water. Before I lift the stencil up, I take a corner of some paper towel and just absorb some of that excess liquid around the perimeter of the rose. Before I go on to the second layer, I use my heat tool to quickly dry it. The second layer is lined up with the bottom of the base layer. Low-tack tape holds the stencil in place. Thin layer of water is added to the opening of the stencil with my watercolor brush. For both the second and the third layers, I'm going to be using the same color Cherry Bomb. So for this layer, I tap on the color fairly sparingly so it will be lighter. And again, before the stencil is removed, I use a corner of paper towel to pick up the excess water and then dry it with my heat tool. The third layer is lined up referring to the illustrated guide, and then I use some low-tack tape again to hold the stencil in place and apply a thin layer of water. I tap on the Cherry Bomb again, but this time I want it to be much more concentrated, so I put a fair amount on. And like before, I just use the watercolor brush and pounce it up and down onto the powder to help move it around a little bit. The excess moisture is removed, and then I dry it before I go on to my fourth and final layer. The rose is completed with a pretty lilac color called Violet Brocade. And then tap, tap, tap with the watercolor brush, and that completes the first rose. And then the second rose that nestles in next to the bigger one is done the very same way. If you are going to use the die, it is important that this rose is lined up properly with the first one. The top petal of the large rose will align perfectly with the base of the smaller one. The look created with the pigment powders is quite different from that of the dye ink. The layers created with the dye inks tend to be more crisp, whereas the layers with the pigment powders are a little bit looser and have a more painterly look. For the base layer of the foliage, I'm using a soft green called Falling Leaves. When this layer is dry, I line up the second part of the stencil for the detail of the leaves, and I'm going to use a nice dark green called Green Parade. And when the light catches these Nouveau Shimmer powders, it is quite something. For the last pair of roses, I'm going to be working with Altenew watercolors using a wet on dry technique. The pretty pink tones that I've chosen from lightest to darkest are Pink Diamond, Puffy Heart, Purple Wine, and Rubelite. The process is a little bit different, but not much, than working with the pigment powders. Before I get started, I add a little bit of water to each of the four colors to soften up the paint. The stencil is placed into position, and then with a brush that is loaded with water, I pick up the color and apply it to the open area. To load the brush with water, it is just simply dipped into the water well. This is referred to as a wet on dry technique because the wet paint is being applied to dry paper. The paint is applied around the perimeter, working towards the center. And like the previous set of roses, between each of the layers I use some paper towel just to remove some of the excess moisture and then apply heat with my heat tool. It doesn't matter which medium that you're working with, whether it's the dye inks, the pigment powders, or the watercolors. The stenciling goes very quickly. I'm going to be using the coordinating die, and so I make sure that I have lined up the smaller rose to the larger one. The top petal of the larger rose nestles in perfectly to the base of the smaller rose. For the base layer, I've used my lightest pink, Pink Diamond. After this layer is completely dry, I take my second detail and line it up to the base of the small rose. With a paintbrush that is loaded with water, I pick up Puffy Heart and apply it to the open area of the stencil. Paper towel is used to pick up some of the excess moisture, and then it is dried with a heat tool. The third detail is lined up onto the rose, and then I apply a darker color called Purple Wine. And again, I dry it completely, and then my final detail, which is the center of the flower, I add some of the darker rubellite to. The base layer for the leaves fits in perfectly around the two roses. The base layer is watercolored with forest glades. Before lining up the second detail layer of the stencil, I pick up the excess moisture with some paper towel and then dry it. The leaves are detailed with a darker green called evergreen. It's a repetitive process. The moisture is removed with some paper towel, and then the final layer is dried. I decided to die cut all 3 pairs of roses. I also die cut some white foam and stacked them so that they would have a little bit of dimension on the card front. The stenciled roses are quick and easy. In keeping with that theme, I've decided to use Altenew's striped circle to create backgrounds. This set includes not just the striped circle background, but also a striped border detail. The border detail was used on 2 of the backgrounds. I simply chose some colored cardstock. I've used a soft pink, a peach, and black, and embossed them in gold. All of the roses were mounted onto the foam die cuts prior to being mounted onto the A2 sized card fronts. The die cut sentiment for this card is one of 2 sentiments that are included with the die for the roses. For the watercolored roses, I used a sentiment that was included in the striped circle stamp set. The bold word in this sentiment was heat embossed, and with a little bit of masking, then the supporting words were inked with black dye ink. Post-it note tape is a good choice for this style of masking. For the card with the pigment powder roses, I chose something from an absolutely gorgeous sentiment stamp set called Beautiful Inside. The cards with the striped border detail are finished off with gold foil pearls, and the card with the striped circle background are finished off with peach foil pearls. And that completes this set of 3 cards featuring a beautiful new layering stencil set by Altenew, Watercolor Roses. I love the varying looks that can be achieved by switching up the mediums. And no matter which one you choose, they're all quick and easy. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I appreciate your visit.